Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, November 7th, 2023. U.S. border security is shaping up to be a sticking point in getting aid for Ukraine through the U.S. Senate. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says a credible border solution must be part of the bill. But the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is calling a list of Senate Republican border-related proposals a total non-starter. Aid for Israel as part of a larger national security emergency spending package not expected to be as controversial, but the Senate Democrats are rejecting the House Republican-passed version that includes an equal amount of money cut from the IRS budget. The U.S. House today debates a resolution to censure Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan, for what the resolution calls her promoting false narratives regarding the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. And in other news, the U.S. Supreme Court hears a Second Amendment challenge to a federal law that prohibits people under domestic violence restraining orders from owning firearms. The Senate confirms a new director of the NIH, National Institute of Health. A former Facebook engineering director tells a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee that he tried and failed to get Facebook to better protect teens from the harms of social media after his young daughter received online solicitations for sex. And Great Britain's King Charles III gives his first speech as king at a state opening of Parliament. A story from Reuters, U.S. Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell warned Democrats on Tuesday it will be hard to get President Joe Biden's supplemental funding request for Ukraine and other priorities across the chamber floor without including border restrictions sought by Republicans. The Kentucky Republican said he spoke by phone with President Biden and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen about the president's supplemental request on Monday. He signaled support for a broad supplemental package that would include aid to Ukraine, Israel, and other priorities. The Reuters article also has this, that House Speaker Mike Johnson, the top Republican in Congress, is pursuing a standalone bill that ties border security provisions directly to Ukraine aid. Here's Senator Mitch McConnell at a news conference.
President Biden and Secretary Yellen called me yesterday because obviously they know I'm generally sympathetic with a broad approach to the supplemental. I did make it clear to both of them that we have to have a credible solution to the wide open border in order to get a bill that includes all of the things that I think are important across the Senate floor. I hope they understood the message, so I'm giving it again today in case there's any confusion about how strongly we feel about this. What is our definition? Senator Lindsey Graham and James Langford are going to handle that for us. It includes both asylum and parole. We're talking about a change in policy, not sending money, for example, to New York or to Chicago. So we're very serious about this, and I think it will be difficult to get the package across the floor in the Senate without a credible border solution.
The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, at a news conference today. Of course, he's referring to the possibility of a filibuster, 60 votes needed to move any legislation. The majority Democrats have more than 50, but not up to 60. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, responding at his own news conference. An article in The Hill talks about what a group of Senate Republicans proposed on Monday, writing, they want the Department of Homeland Security to resume construction of the southwestern border wall, beef up pay for Border Patrol agents, reform the nation's asylum laws, crack down on humanitarian parole of illegal migrants, and deny asylum to migrants who cross through safe third countries before coming to the United States. Here's Senator Schumer.
So we have a busy 2 weeks ahead of us as we work together to avoid an unnecessary government shutdown, provide critical aid to our allies in Ukraine and Israel, including humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians in Gaza that need food, water, shelter. The outcome of all of this hangs on one word, bipartisanship. Unfortunately, a group of Senate Republicans released a radical border security proposal that's a non-starter in the Senate. No discussion with any Democrat, no inkling of bipartisanship. Instead of putting together common sense border policies that can pass in divided government, Senate Republicans basically copied and pasted the House's radical H.R. 2 bill, all at the expense of Ukrainian freedom, independence, democracy. Taking Ukraine funding hostage in exchange for hard-right border policies make this fight much harder for us to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin. We're still resolute. We want to get it done. But every day the Republicans delay is another win for Putin. Large segments of both parties in the Senate support Ukraine. So we should be coming together to show our support, not just pushing political proposals that will only further endanger Ukraine. And many of those pushing the proposals are not even for Ukraine aid. So what are we talking about?
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at a news conference today. Another article from Reuters. U.S. Senate Democrats on Tuesday blocked a Republican effort to win quick approval for a bill providing emergency aid to Israel that passed the House of Representatives last week, but that provides no assistance for Ukraine's war against Russia. Democrats objected, stressing the importance of providing aid to Ukraine as well as Israel, in addition to humanitarian aid, border security funding, and money to push back against China in the Indo-Pacific. That was in a $106 billion funding request President Joe Biden sent to Congress last month. They also accused House Republicans of playing politics with the crisis in Israel, delaying aid for the Jewish state by tying support to cutting funding for the Internal Revenue Service, a favorite target for Republicans, rather than writing a bipartisan bill. That's the reporting from Reuters. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, promoted that House-passed bill to aid Israel. It was at a news conference today with the families of hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza.
Today is the one-month anniversary of Hamas's horrific attack on the world's only Jewish state. The atrocities of that day and those following it have left a dark and indelible stain on the entire world. Everyone can see these atrocities. And as the Prime Minister Netanyahu said very clearly, this is a battle between light and darkness, between good and evil. As our cherished friend and ally Israel fights for its survival against the Iran-backed terrorists of Hamas, we will continue to stand up for human dignity and offer moral clarity. House Republicans understand that this moment demands decisive action, and we insist that we cannot waste any more time getting Israel the aid that it desperately needs. That's why, as the first act of my speakership, we passed a resolution condemning Hamas and reaffirming our solemn commitment to Israel. Days later, with bipartisan margins, we passed the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act to provide billions in assistance to Israel in its time of great peril. And as we mark the one-month anniversary of this attack, House Republicans met with and heard from family members of some of the victims, not only to understand their grief and pain and worries, but to make clear why Israel must do everything in its power to wipe out Hamas and ensure that what happened October 7th can never happen again.
House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, at a news conference today with other House Republican leaders and family members of hostages held by Hamas. One of those family members, Doris Lieber, her son, is being held captive.
I'm here because it's been 30 days. Every day is like eternity to me, and I can't wait any longer because I know that he was shot. I don't know anything. Maybe everything is we don't know. We don't have a list of the hostages. We don't know their condition. I don't have anything. So I need your help, basically. I'm part of your people. You're part of Israel, and America has been like the best allies, and I'm so proud of being an American, being an Israeli as well. But I do need you now because there's nothing helping me now. I pray, which I didn't do before, but just please help me.
Doris Lieber, the mother of a hostage held by Hamas, at a news conference today in Washington, along with House Republicans. Congressman Brad Sherman, Democrat from California, held a separate news conference with other relatives of other hostages. We covered both of these news conferences. You can find the video at cspan.org. On the House floor, debate on a resolution that would censure Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan, alleging that she promoted false narratives about the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th and has called for Israel's destruction. A procedural vote to table or kill the resolution failed. That vote was 208 to 213 with one voting present. That present vote, Susan Wild, Democrat of Pennsylvania, and that allowed the debate to proceed, which will eventually lead to a final passage vote. The procedural vote, mostly party line. 6 Republicans voted to table or kill the resolution. 1 Democrat voted not to table and allow it to go on. That was Brad Schneider of Illinois. Sponsor of the resolution, Congressman Rich McCormick, Republican from Georgia.
We've seen the effects of the reprehensible rhetoric of Representative Tlaib across the nation. At the schools and colleges around the country, Jewish students have been forced to be on alert as their anti-Semitic peers have engaged in disgusting demonstrations, chanting anti-Semitic slogans. At Cooper Union, a private college in New York, Jewish students were forced to hide from pro-Hamas protesters in a library where they feared for their safety. At George Washington University, just about a half mile from this building, students broadcast "Glory to our martyrs" and "Free Palestinian from river to the sea" on the side of the campus building. Further, yesterday in Ventura County, California, Paul Kessler, a Jewish man protesting for Israel, was killed as an altercation with pro-Palestinian protesters. These anti-Semitic incidents are happening right now in America in 2023, and quite frankly, in my entire lifetime, I've never seen anything like it. The same nation that defended Nazism in World War II must now defeat an internal rot promoting the same senseless violence and hatred of Jewish people. It is a sad fact, but this type of anti-Semitic hate is being promoted by a small group of members in this body, chiefly Representative Tlaib. We must hold her accountable. This war in Israel is affecting everyone, whether it's innocent Palestinians at risk because of Hamas's actions or our fellow Jewish Americans who now have to worry each day about the possibility of an anti-Semitic attack.
Congressman Rich McCormick, Republican from Georgia, sponsor of the privileged resolution that would censure Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan. Congresswoman Tlaib spoke against the resolution.
I'm the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, Mr. Chair, and my perspective is needed here now more than ever. I will not be silenced, and I will not let you distort my words. Folks forget I'm from the city of Detroit, the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, where I learned to speak truth to power even if my voice shakes. Trying to bully or censor me won't work, because this movement for a ceasefire is much bigger than one person. It's growing every single day. There are millions of people across our country who oppose Netanyahu's extremism and are done watching our government support collective punishment and the use of white phosphorus bombs that melt flesh to the bone. They are done watching our government, Mr. Chair, supporting cutting off food, water, electricity, and medical care to millions of people with nowhere to go. Like me, Mr. Chair, they don't believe the answer to war crimes is more war crimes. The refusal of Congress and the administration to acknowledge Palestinian lives is chipping away at my soul. Over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. Majority were children. But let me be clear. My criticism has always been of the Israeli government and Netanyahu's actions. It is important to separate people and governments, Mr. Chair. No government is beyond criticism. The idea that criticizing the government of Israel is anti-Semitic sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's being used to silence diverse voices speaking up for human rights across our nation. Do you realize what it's like, Mr. Chair, for the people outside the chamber right now, listening in agony to their own government dehumanizing them? To hear the President of the United States we helped elect dispute death tolls as we see video after video of dead children and parents under rubble? Mr. Chair, do you know what it's like to fear rising hate crimes, to know how Islamophobia and anti-Semitism makes us all less safe, and worry that your own child might suffer the horrors that 6-year-old Wadia did in Illinois? I can't believe I have to say this, but Palestinian people are not disposable.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan, today on the House floor, a final vote on the resolution that would censure her, expected to happen on Wednesday. Associated Press reporting from the Gaza Strip, Israel said Tuesday that its ground forces were battling Hamas fighters deep inside Gaza's largest city, signaling a major new stage in the month-old conflict, and its leaders foresee controlling the enclave's security after the war. The push into Gaza City guarantees that the already staggering death toll will rise further, while comments from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about controlling Gaza's security for an indefinite period pointed to an uncertain endgame of a war that Israel says will be long and difficult. That was from Associated Press. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in an ABC News interview on Monday, "I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have the overall security responsibility because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we couldn't imagine." Today, the U.S. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel was asked about that.
If I could ask about some comments that Netanyahu made yesterday about who should govern Gaza when fighting is over. He said he thinks Israel, for an indefinite period, will have overall security responsibility. What's your take on those comments? Have you sought any clarification from the Israeli government about what they meant by that? Do you have any concerns?
So we, of course, engage with our partners in the Israeli government about a number of things, especially currently as this situation continues to be ongoing. I would refer you to the Prime Minister's office for further elaboration on that particular quote. Our viewpoint is that Palestinians must be at the forefront of these decisions, and Gaza is Palestinian land, and it will remain Palestinian land. And generally speaking, we do not support reoccupation of Gaza, and neither does Israel. Secretary Blinken was fairly clear about that during his travels as well. But it's important to note that at the same time, we agree with Israel that there is no returning to the October 6th status quo. Israel and the region must be secure, and Gaza should and can no longer be a base from which to launch terror attacks against the people of Israel or anyone else. And so we're working with partners on various scenarios, on interim governance, on security parameters, on security situations in Gaza for once this crisis recedes, but I'm not going to get ahead of that process. We'll get into it from here.
Vedant Patel is the State Department deputy spokesperson at his news conference today. Jared Zuba, Pentagon correspondent for Al Monitor, posting U.S. deterrence in the Middle East has been incredibly strong. Pentagon deputy spokesperson Sabrina Singh tells reporters, despite uptick in attacks on troops in Iraq and Syria, Pentagon counts 40 total attacks since October 17th, 22 attacks in Iraq, 18 in Syria. You're listening to Washington Today. The Supreme Court on Tuesday, writes NBC News, indicated it would uphold a federal law that prohibits people under domestic violence restraining orders from owning firearms, potentially limiting the scope of its own major gun rights ruling from last year. The case gives the court's 6-3 conservative majority a chance to consider the broad ramifications of the 2022 decision, which for the first time found that there is a right to bear arms outside the home under the Constitution's Second Amendment. The ruling in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin made it clear that gun restrictions had to be analyzed based on a historical understanding of the right to bear arms. As such, the decision raised questions about many existing gun restrictions that gun rights activists say are not anchored in historical tradition. But during oral argument, the justice appeared receptive to Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar's argument that the prohibition fits within a long tradition of disarming people who are considered a danger to society. That summary from NBC News. C-SPAN covered the oral argument in today's case, U.S. v. Rahimi. Here is the Chief Justice, John Roberts, questioning the Solicitor General.
Is someone who drives 30 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, does that person qualify as law-abiding or not?
I think that wouldn't qualify to the extent that it's classified as a misdemeanor or minor criminal conduct under state law. And I do want to be clear that we certainly think that wouldn't apply under the not responsible category. But if you're focusing on law-abiding in particular, we think that history and tradition there support the conclusion that you can disarm those who have committed serious crimes. So it's not just that any kind of conduct that is an offense would qualify.
Are you making a misdemeanor felony distinction?
That's the line that history and tradition reflect. And so, yes, I think that that is the relevant category with respect to law-abiding citizens. But again, I would just emphasize here, we're not directly invoking the law-abiding aspect of the principle because Mr. Rahimi didn't have the kind of criminal record that would justify disarmament on that basis. Instead, our arguments here are directed at the aspect of the standard focused on those who are not responsible.
Responsibility is a very broad concept. I mean, not taking your recycling to the curb on Thursdays. I mean, if it's a serious problem, it's irresponsible. Setting a bad example, by yelling at a basketball game in a particular way. It seems to me that the problem with responsibility is that it's extremely broad, and what seems irresponsible to some people might seem like, well, that's not a big deal to others. So what is the model? I mean, do you go back to what was irresponsible at the common law, or take a poll and see if people think it's irresponsible, to get into a fist fight at a sports event where tempers were running high, or what?
So I want to be really clear that we're not using the term not responsible to describe colloquially anyone who you might describe as demonstrating irresponsibility in many of those contexts that you just described in your hypotheticals. Instead, we read this court's case law, and in particular, its articulation of that principle, we're tracking the court's language here, the principle of responsibility as being intrinsically tied to the danger you would present if you have access to firearms. And I would draw a parallel here to the principles the court has articulated with respect to sensitive places or with dangerous and unusual weapons. In each of these categories.
Just to be clear, you're using responsible as a placeholder for dangerous with respect to the use of firearms?
Correct. So that's how we understand history and tradition in this context. And the reason that we've used the term not responsible is it's because it's the standard that this court itself has articulated in Heller and repeated in McDonald and then repeated again in Bruin. I think probably the reason the court has used the term not responsible is it gets at the idea that some of the categories of people who can be disarmed might not intend to be dangerous. They might not be culpable in that sense, like the mentally ill or minors. And so I think responsibility gets at the idea that they might not actually intend to be a danger, but in fact would present the danger if they.
U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar questioned by Chief Justice John Roberts at today's Supreme Court oral argument. The attorney for Zaki Rahimi, in this case, U.S. v. Rahimi, Matthew Wright, argued that the federal ban on domestic abusers owning firearms is unconstitutional because it was not part of the intent of the writers of the Second Amendment. Here are questions from Justice Elena Kagan.
And I'm just going to read you a sentence from the brief, and I want to know whether that's your essential argument. It says, the government has yet to find even a single American jurisdiction that adopted a similar ban while the founding generation walked the earth. So is that what we should be looking for? And if we don't find that similar ban, we say that the government has no right to do anything?
Your Honor, I think that's largely what Bruin says. However, I don't think it has to be so narrow. So if the government could affirmatively prove from the historical tradition of either American firearms laws, or even I would be willing to spot them the way that we have treated other fundamental constitutionally protected rights. If they could tie it to one of those historical traditions, that would be good enough under the logic of Bruin, if not the exact rule of decision.
Because I'm not quite sure what the answer means. I mean, I took that sentence to be saying we're looking for a regulation that, even if it's not every jot and tittle, is essentially targeting the same kind of conduct as the regulation under review. And, the Solicitor General told us that was the wrong approach, that what Bruin really directs courts to do is to think about the various principles that were operating at that time, whether those principles gave rise to a particular regulation that was near identical to the one under review. And so I guess I'm asking you to comment on those two ways of understanding Bruin.
I think both methodological positions lead to the same result, which is affirmance of the decision below. It's not just something that is about domestic violence or a ban that's punishable by exactly 10 years. In other words, that's the way that some of the amici have described what we're arguing for. I'm saying there's no ban. There's no history of bans for people who were part of the national community. They don't exist. I'm saying that the plain text of the Second Amendment, the way that it distinguished from the English common law tradition, I'm saying that the early commentators like St. George Tucker and William Rawle, they all said, if you're just keeping the firearm.
So, but that does suggest, I mean, that you're looking for a ban on domestic violence. 200 some years ago, the problem of domestic violence was conceived very differently. People had a different understanding of the harm. People had a different understanding of the right of government to try to prevent the harm. People had different understandings with respect to pretty much every aspect of the problem. So if you're looking for a ban on domestic violence, it's not going to be there.
Justice Kagan, I'm looking for a ban. I'm looking for a ban, a criminal punishment for just the keeping of a firearm.
Attorney Matthew Wright questioned by Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan during oral argument today. Forbes magazine summarizing the Supreme Court will issue its ruling in the case sometime before the court's term wraps up in June 2024. In addition to U.S. v. Rahimi, the court also announced Friday it intends to take up another major gun control issue with two cases concerning whether bump stocks, which allow semi-automatic rifles to function as machine guns, can be legally banned. The court still has not scheduled when it will hear oral arguments in that case. Additionally, the court will hear a more tangential gun rights case with National Rifle Association v. Vullo, a First Amendment dispute brought by the NRA after the head of New York's Department of Financial Services urged banks and insurance companies to stop doing business with gun rights organizations. That reporting from Forbes magazine. The director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Colette Peters, testified today before a House Judiciary Subcommittee about efforts to reform her agency, which, as an AP article recently put it, has long been plagued by staffing shortages, chronic violence, and other problems. Congresswoman Cori Bush, Democrat from Missouri, asked Director Peters about the use of solitary confinement.
It is shameful that solitary has increased in the Bureau during the Biden administration, despite the president claiming he supported ending it. Director Peters, you have repeatedly recognized the harms of solitary and the need for holistic rehabilitative alternatives. You and I both know that solitary causes devastating harm and it worsens safety for everyone involved. It drives anxiety, depression, psychosis, heart disease, self-harm, and suicide. And I know you know this from even before in your background before you took this position. And we also know that environments that are the exact opposite of solitary involve program-based interventions with full days of out-of-cell time and how that actually help both support people's health and it makes makes everyone safer, even the staff, because we also care about the staff. So instead of taking action on this issue based on the overwhelming evidence, the proposal of further studies, can we talk about that? Isn't it true that we don't need yet another study, but rather an urgent action to replace solitary with proven alternative forms of separation?
Congresswoman, first I'll address your health care issue. I want you to assure you we want to be the model. And as we pivot out of the pandemic, we're working through our backlog of that preventative health care that happened at the Bureau of Prisons just like it happened in our communities. And we have secured a contract with an external group of experts who are going to come in and do a quality assurance of our health care and help us create that future vision where we can be the example. As it relates to restrictive housing, I want to move as fast as you do, Congresswoman, but I also know that we have to bring our people along, and I don't want to take a tool away from our correctional officers today without replacing it with a new tool tomorrow and with that training to ensure their safety. So we do have a short-term plan and a long-term plan. I think you'll be pleased to know the short-term plan is, first, we ensured that all the recommendations that have been brought to the Bureau in the past have been implemented. And then our group of experts have traveled across the country to get best practices from other systems and bringing it back. We're actually meeting next week as an executive team. We will review those recommendations and get moving on that work. And then the partnership with NIJ is historic, Congresswoman. It's the first time that the Federal Bureau of Prisons will have an outside entity come in and take this global of a look at our restrictive housing. You and I share the same values. The more normalized environment we can create for the adults in custody, the better outcomes they'll have in the community, the fewer victims that will be created, and as you said, and most importantly, a better work environment for our people.
Thank you. Looking forward to that, and our office will be in contact as that moves forward.
Congresswoman Cori Bush, Democrat from Missouri, questioning Colette Peters, director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, at today's subcommittee hearing. Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, used his time for questions to ask about one particular prisoner, John Strand, who was convicted in connection with January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, sentenced this past June to 32 months in prison and a $10,000 fine.
What I'm worried about is that Mr. Strand gave us testimony about some of his concerns, and as you know, people give us testimony. We sort through what's right and wrong and should be acted on and shouldn't be acted on. It's not gospel, it's just testimony. But then thereafter, people were posting on some of his social media platforms his concerns about the treatment he'd received at the Bureau. And then I sent a letter to you concerned about that because, like you, I don't want anyone retaliated against for constitutionally protected speech. And thereafter, I got a letter back from the aforementioned Office of Legislative Affairs in your office, and they say, in part, Mr. Strand was moved to a secure housing unit with increased supervision and frequent employee contact on September 26, 2023, pending completion of an investigation. So I guess my question is, when someone, is that like akin to what we would normally think about as solitary confinement? Those words, secure housing unit with increased supervision and frequent employee contact?
We would use the word restrictive housing.
Okay. So what's this then? Because this guy's a non-violent, he was never violent toward anyone, so I'm just wondering why the assets that we fund for the highest acuity violent people would be used for this purpose.
Congressman, we use that special housing unit for individuals that engage in any sort of misconduct inside our institutions. I don't know what he was found to be guilty of by our hearings administrative process that would warrant his need to go into restrictive housing, but I assure you we have administrative processes that people have to go through before those placements actually occur.
Colette Peters, director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, questioned by Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, at a Judiciary Subcommittee hearing today. The Bureau says that there are currently 158,000 federal inmates. That's down from a high of 219,000 a decade ago. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source. On C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcast and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. The Senate today confirmed Dr. Monica Bertagnolli as head of NIH, National Institutes of Health, filling a vacancy that is nearly 2 years old. She is a cancer surgeon who has been the director of the National Cancer Institute for the past year. The Senate vote was 62 to 36. It was bipartisan, 13 Republicans voting yes, with most Democrats, 2 members of the Democratic caucus in the Senate voting no. One was Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, chair of the Health Committee, who spoke on the Senate floor.
In my view, at this crisis moment for American health care, we need an NIH director who is prepared to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and use every tool at their disposal to substantially lower the extraordinarily high cost of medicine in this country. The 1,800 well-paid lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry here in D.C., it's almost 4 lobbyists for every member of Congress, may not like it, but that is precisely what the American people want, and it is what they need. The status quo is not working. We need fundamental changes in the way that the NIH addresses the crisis of high prescription drug costs. Dr. Monica Bertagnolli is an intelligent and caring person. but she has not convinced me that she is prepared to take on the greed and power of the drug companies and the healthcare industry in general. Nor is she prepared, in my view, to fight for the transformative changes the NIH needs at this critical moment. And that is why I will be voting no on her confirmation.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on the Senate floor before the vote to confirm Dr. Bertagnolli as NIH director. One other member of the Senate Democratic Caucus voted no, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. The final vote was 62 to 36, most Democrats and 13 Republicans voting yes. And the Senate Appropriations Committee Chair Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, saying on the Senate floor that Dr. Bertagnolli is the right person to ensure the NIH stays on the cutting edge of innovation and research and fulfills its critical mission to promote health, improve equity, keep our nation competitive, and give patients across the world real hope for the future. Wall Street today, the Dow up 56, NASDAQ up 121, S&P up 12. Another high-profile congressional hearing today about social media and dangers to children. CNN puts it this way, that Meta's top executives, including CEO Mark Zuckerberg, ignored warnings for years about harms to teens on its platforms, such as Instagram, a company whistleblower told the Senate subcommittee on Tuesday. Meta instead fosters a culture of see no evil, hear no evil that overlooks evidence of harm internally while publicly presenting carefully crafted metrics to downplay the issue, said Arturo Bejar, an ex-Facebook engineering director and consultant. That from CNN. Here's part of his opening statement.
Starting in 2009, I was the engineering and product leader for Facebook's efforts to reduce online threats to both children and adults. I met regularly with senior executives, including Mark Zuckerberg, and they were supportive of this work. As a parent, I took the work personally, and I worked hard to help create a safer environment. By the time I left in 2015, I felt the work was going in the right direction. A few years later, my 14-year-old daughter joined Instagram. She and her friends began having awful experiences, including repeated unwanted sexual advances, harassment. She reported these incidents to the company, and it did nothing. In large part because of what I learned as her father, in October of 2019, I returned to Facebook, this time as a consultant with Instagram's well-being team. We tried to set goals based on the experiences of teens themselves. Instead, the company wanted to focus on enforcing its own narrowly defined policies, regardless of whether that approach reduced the harm that teens were experiencing. I discovered that most of the tools for kids that we had put in place during my earlier time at Facebook had been removed. I observed new features being developed in response to public outcry, which were in reality kind of a placebo, a safety feature in name only, to placate the press and regulators. I say this because rather than being based on user experience data, they were based on very deliberately narrow definitions of harm. The company was grading its own homework.
Arturo Bejar, former Facebook engineering director and later consultant, testifying before Senate Judiciary Subcommittee today. Senators on the committee of both parties receptive to this message. Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, the chair of the subcommittee, posting, "My Judiciary Subcommittee is hearing from a whistleblower who warned Facebook and Meta's senior leadership about the harms their products are causing young people. Instead of acting, Meta hid the problem and did nothing to fix it. That must end now." And Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, with this post, a whistleblower has come forward to expose how leaders at Meta specifically ignored harms to kids and teens on their platforms. Here's what he had to say in today's hearing, and she included some video. The newest senator in the Senate and on the committee, LaFonza Butler, Democrat from California, asked the witness about other potential harms to children from social media.
You know, and we know that the internet can be a hateful place. We've talked about that today. I understand that among your research in Meta's user experience, you looked into instances of identity-based hostilities on the platform. And you found that over a quarter of Instagram users under the age of 16 said they witnessed hostility against someone based on their race, religion, or identity within the last week. One study published in the Journal of American Academy of Children and Adolescent Psychiatry looked at the issue of online racial discrimination between March and November of 2020. It found that Black youth experienced increases on online racial discrimination that their white counterparts did not. And those instances of discrimination predicted worsened same day and next day mental health amongst Black youth. Mr. Behar, can you talk with us a little bit about what more you think the company should be doing to protect against these kinds of racial and ethnic harassments and hostility online?
Sorry. The fact that a child today, right, Black, any identity, right, gets called out in front of the entire shared audience. Again, the difference between when this happens in a school and when it happens online. Right? Go home, ask your child, what would you do? What can you do? And there's no way for that child to say, this is what's happening to me. Somebody's being really mean to me. And I use that language because 10 years ago, Facebook knew this. We knew that in order to help a child dealing with an issue and help them, you have to hear the words that they use. A 13-year-old does not like to report things because they're worried they're going to get in trouble and get other people in trouble. So you tell them, would you like some help? And if you look at the work that I submitted from 10 years ago, you should be able to say, you know, this is like awful for me because of my identity, any form of that. And the company should be able to take that into account to help that child be protected and then get them resources, and then also make sure that that is not acceptable behavior in the community, because the most tragic thing about that 20% number witnessing these kinds of attacks is that the lack of action on part of the company and the very narrow definition of the content that they would take down means that they're normalizing the behavior. Children watch and children learn from the way other children are behaving.
Arturo Behar, former Facebook engineering director and consultant, questioned by Senator LaFonza Butler, Democrat from California, at today's Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law hearing. You can find the full video at our archive, cspan.org. In Great Britain, King Charles III gave his first speech as king to open Parliament, a speech written by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's government, outlining its agenda. It was an ornate and old ceremony. The King and Queen, Queen Camilla, arriving in a horse-drawn carriage, the King wearing the robes and imperial crown, speaking in the House of Lords with the Parliament before him. The King began by paying tribute to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, before talking about the legislative priorities of the government.
My lords and members of the House of Commons, it is mindful of a legacy of service and devotion to this country set by my beloved mother, the late Queen, that I deliver this, the first King's speech in over 70 years. The impact of COVID and the war in Ukraine have created significant long-term challenges for the United Kingdom. That is why my government's priority is to make the difficult but necessary long-term decisions to change this country for the better. My minister's focus is on increasing economic growth and safeguarding the health and security of the British people for generations to come. My government will continue to take action to bring down inflation, to ease the cost of living for families, and help businesses fund new jobs and investment.
King Charles III giving his first speech as king at a state opening of British Parliament today in London. The New York Times writing about the substance of the 10-minute speech For a lifelong supporter of environmental causes, a plan to expand oil and gas drilling in the North Sea was probably not what the king had hoped to announce when he opened Britain's parliament for the first time as monarch. But on Tuesday, the new king outlined this and 20 of the government's other legislative priorities in a tradition-steeped ceremony that required a display of the deadpan political neutrality for which his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, was famous. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. It's free, and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.